Hi everyone, thank you for coming to my talk. I'm Jennifer Cearns and I'm a digital anthropologist and also a senior UX researcher in the healthcare sector. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about how I bring those two complementary but slightly different attitudes into the current work I'm doing in the digital mental health care space. As I'm sure that many of my audience will know, artificial intelligence or AI and machine learning have gained considerable momentum in the last few years, especially. And it is actually implemented in a huge amount of the public services that we all consume every day. So for example, AI is now used to identify tax evasion patterns. It's used to sort through infrastructural data to target bridge inspections. My last research project actually was about how it's used to sift through health and social service data to prioritize cases for child welfare and support. And of course, especially in the last year, it's also been used to predict the spread of infectious disease. And the use of AI is certainly starting to offer a lot of new possibilities for the delivery of healthcare services, which of course in turn has really accelerated because of the pandemic. Intel recently did a survey of healthcare decision makers, and they found that the percentage of respondents who were currently implementing some kind of AI solution in their healthcare company had nearly doubled since the onset of COVID-19. But of most interest to me, I guess, is that especially during the pandemic, this has really started to expand into the mental health and well-being space as well, which is perhaps unsurprising. It's been a very challenging year for everybody. And certainly in the UK and in many other countries, it is very challenging to get mental health care support through the NHS. There are very long waiting lists. And so the demand for telehealth options, things like AI chatbots, which I'll talk about today, has really skyrocketed. So these are apps that typically include a sort of tracking feature, which monitors your mood. And then they'll often also have a sort of talking therapy type component. And these generally work through some kind of messaging or chatbot. One of the most famous examples you can see on the left-hand side of the screen here is called Replica. It's very well known for having a very lifelike customizable avatar. And they've seen an increase in traffic of 35% during the pandemic. So I was going to try and I'll keep it brief, but a brief little diversion, because I think it's important just to trace what I at least see as the intellectual history sitting behind some of these developments before I come back to the chatbots more towards the end of the talk. So Jeremy Bentham, I'm sure most of the audience will be familiar with his work. An English philosopher from the mid-1700s, very famously invented a social control mechanism utilized in the prison systems called the panopticon. And the basic premise behind the idea was that prisoners would feel under observation at all times and therefore would modify their behavior accordingly. And ultimately, the idea really was that the design of the physical space would create an environment that would elicit better behavior. And it was that element that Michel Foucault then very famously expanded upon, taking the idea of the panopticon sort of beyond the prison context and developing it more into a symbol of social control, which extends into all aspects of everyday life for all citizens, not just for prisoners. And Foucault very famously argued that this is the way that citizens internalize authority and also sort of social norms. So for example, you're driving at night, you come to a red traffic light, you probably stop, even if there's nobody else present, there are no repercussions if you ran the red light, you'll probably have internalized the authority enough to obey the law and to self-impose it. And so this is really sort of, I guess, an example of what Foucault argues is self-subjectification, that we consistently take an active part in making ourselves subject to normalizing power structures. Now, the reason, I'm not just talking about this for fun, the reason I think it's relevant is because this same design principle of the panopticon was also applied to the architectural plans of early asylums and psychiatric hospitals. And the idea was that those in charge of the asylum would look at patients' behavior and decide what was good or bad or abnormal, and that physical isolation combined with close monitoring would lead to introspection on the part of the patient. And that this in turn would be curative for those displaying what were called behavioral disorders. And I should caveat that this is at a time in the late 19th century when insanity was considered akin to social deviancy, and medical treatment was inherently bound up with a form of moralizing treatment as well. But essentially the idea really was that by causing the mad to recognize their condition, their state of madness, it was felt that this madness could then start to be cured. And I mentioned this because this in turn really heavily influenced the likes of Sigmund Freud. And I argue, and many others have argued, that you can trace this through into the development of modern psychiatry, right the way through to the idea of talking therapies, which of course are very prevalent today and are at the center of the design of some of these new apps that are coming out on the market right now. So there we go. That was a very potted intellectual history of how I think we've arrived at where we are today, which is to say a widespread conviction that by monitoring our own health and our own well-being, we could in turn start to control it to an extent and to influence our health and our happiness for the better. And so there are numerous apps and digital services being developed right now that promise to bring AI into the setting to further augment our own powers of self-perception. So for example, the way that we use our smartphones and computers, like our typing rhythms, our swiping habits, our turn of phrase, errors in our typing, all of these things are data points which can be compiled into a mental health portrait of the user. And perhaps the biggest example of how this is being used is an American company called MindStrong. I won't comment on the name, but they claim that they can successfully diagnose depression, anxiety, and other psychiatric disorders, that's their wording, on the basis of some of these data points. And then many of these new apps also deploy chatbots as a conversational agent. So think talking therapy, but administered not by a human, but instead by an AI. And they take you through a variety of therapeutic techniques. So AI therapy bots encourage people to vent frustrations and then to reflect on these experiences and these emotions. And then in the meantime, there's also some data analysis happening in the background to track your mood. And this can then be visualized to the user as an externalized graphic of the user's current state of mind. So you can see this in some of the images here on the slide. You can see these sort of graphs, which are supposed to somehow sum up your mental state of well-being or unwellness even. And then machine learning can be applied to this data to start to detect or even to predict when a person is feeling, quote, unwell, which might be relative to their own tracked progress, or it might even be that they are unwell in comparison to the wider populational data that the app and that the AI, the algorithm is running against. And so patients are encouraged to introspect, to self-surveil, and essentially to monitor their own state of mind, which is the first step towards them potentially unlearning or unpicking some of these sort of undesirable emotional responses. But I think a key secondary element here is also this idea that it could be predictive, and that we can then compare ourselves at a data level against a wider population and start to discern sort of well from unwell, normal from abnormal, etc. So, you might think this is all sounding a bit creepy, and I can't say I blame you. I often think that too. And this is, I guess, where I bring my UX hat out, because that in and of itself is also a problem. It does sound kind of creepy, but there is actually some built-in clinical evidence that for some people, this kind of intervention can be beneficial. And I guess this is where I come in with my UX hat on. So aside from thinking about these ideas very critically, part of my job is also to research and design how we could essentially build empathy into a non-sentient conversational agent. The capacity to show affective empathy, or the ability to observe, to imagine, to infer another's emotional state, obviously is not something that a chatbot or an algorithm has. And so this actually has to be quite consciously designed. And that in turn requires a very holistic view of what a conversational about emotion should look and feel like. So essentially what we have to do here is to come up with some code to simulate empathy in a way that's meaningful enough to people that they feel listened to. So it's quite a challenge. How can a chatbot seem human? So if you were to dissect an AI, you would find algorithms and scripts. And these are basically rules that humans use to direct the AI's behavior. And so with something like a chatbot, the coders train the AI to automatically produce certain phrases in response to what I type in, for example. And then you can add in punctuation or emojis, other stylistic elements that will provide the bot with a sense of personality. And this is something that the biggest tech companies are really interested in now. So for example, Microsoft has a product called Shall Ice, which explicitly positions itself as an empathetic social chatbot, and it has 660 million users. But I guess I also think there's another question here, which is, to what extent do we want to feel like we're talking to a bot? Would we prefer it to look and feel human, or something in the middle, a humanoid avatar like Replica has, for example? And these are things that require research, right? So, I recently did some testing sessions with some people who were using Wobot, which is another AI-based therapeutic chatbot on the market. And you can see it on the right-hand side of the screen here. In fact, I'll just move my video so you can see the conversation I had with it. And interestingly, it really actually leans into this kind of bot thing. I talked about, my creators gave me a communication algorithm, sort of sounds a bit like Frankenstein almost. And it uses it almost as a comic device, the fact that it's not human. And I thought that was a little bit weird personally, but then I went and tested it. And I spoke, for example, I did some research with a man who really needed some mental health support, but was autistic. And he found interacting with other humans to be quite overwhelming at the best of times, not to mention in the context of emotional vulnerability. And he actually felt far more comfortable using this chatbot app than speaking to a human. And it really benefited him. He actually really engaged with it for many months. So, I've sounded very negative about it, but I do also think there are some real, positive implications it could have for accessibility, for opening up other ways of talking about emotion. And so I guess for me as an anthropologist, I'm most interested in the fact that empathy is not an absolute, it's culturally and socially relative. And the way that this kind of interaction should look and feel will vary enormously based on gender identity, language, cultural identity. And this is where I think anthropologists need to be increasingly involved in the development of these tools. I firmly believe that these technological developments can increase access to much needed support, but there's not a great deal of input from social scientists like anthropologists at the moment, both to critique that normalizing power discourse of, abnormal versus normal, and there's a lot to get into there, but also to help to design, what empathy can look and feel like to as diverse a group of people as possible. So there we go, in a whirlwind, in a nutshell, that is, why I'm interested in this. And I'm going to stop there, but I'm very, very happy to pick up anything and everything in some questions at the end. Thank you very much.